What happens when Hollywood's most respected actor, a man who's spent decades earning reverence through dignity and craft, finds himself face to face with a talk show host who mistakes that dignity for weakness? You're about to witness the moment Denzel Washington's legendary composure met its match, and how one evening's entertainment became a masterclass in why some lines should never be crossed. The Jimmy Kimmel live studio hummed with its usual pre-show energy that Tuesday evening, but beneath the familiar chaos of cameras being positioned and audience members settling into their seats, something felt different. Jimmy Kimmel stood behind his desk, shuffling through his note cards with the kind of predatory focus that his longtime producers had learned to recognize. Tonight's guest was Denzel Washington, and Kimmel had spent the better part of the afternoon crafting what he believed would be television gold. "Make sure we get tight shots when I bring up the family stuff," Kimmel murmured to his director during the final sound check. "I want to see every micro-expression." Across the studio, in the green-walled guest waiting area, Denzel sat in composed silence. At 68, he carried himself with the same quiet authority that had made him one of Hollywood's most formidable presences. His hands rested calmly on his knees, but there was something in the set of his shoulders, a subtle tension, that spoke of a man who had learned, through decades in the spotlight, to read the intentions of those around him. The makeup artist had finished her work 20 minutes ago, but Denzel remained in his chair, his dark eyes fixed on the monitor showing Kimmel's opening monologue. He'd done this dance countless times before, sitting in green rooms and backstage areas, preparing to smile and laugh and promote whatever project had brought him there. But tonight felt different. The questions during the pre-interview had carried an edge, a probing quality that set off alarm bells honed by years of protecting what mattered most to him. "Mr. Washington?" The young production assistant appeared, at his elbow, clipboard in hand, a nervous smile plastered across her face. "We're ready for you in 2 minutes." Denzel nodded, rising from his chair with the fluid grace of a man who had never forgotten the athlete he'd once been. As he straightened, his jacket, a perfectly tailored charcoal number that spoke of understated elegance, he caught his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him held the same calm expression he'd worn to 1,000 interviews, but behind his eyes was the watchful intensity of a father who had spent decades shielding his family from the hungry gaze of public scrutiny. The applause from the main studio grew louder as Kimmel wrapped up his monologue, and somewhere in that sound Denzel heard something that made his jaw tighten almost imperceptibly. Tonight would be different indeed. The studio lights blazed with their familiar intensity as Denzel settled into the guest chair, his movements measured and deliberate. The audience's applause washed over him like a warm tide, and he acknowledged them with the gracious nod that had become his trademark, genuine appreciation tempered with the dignity of a man who had never forgotten where he came from. "Ladies and gentlemen, the incredible Denzel Washington." Kimmel's voice carried its usual theatrical enthusiasm, but Denzel's trained ear caught something else beneath it: hunger, the kind of predatory anticipation that made seasoned actors like himself shift almost imperceptibly in their chairs. "Jimmy, good to see you again," Denzel said, extending his hand across the small space between them. His smile was warm, professional, but his eyes remained watchful. "Always a pleasure, Denzel. Always a pleasure." Kimmel settled back behind his desk, that familiar grin spreading across his face as he glanced down at his carefully prepared notes. "So, you're here to talk about your new film, but I have to say, there's been quite a bit of news about the Washington family lately." The temperature in the studio seemed to drop by several degrees, though the change was so subtle that only the most observant audience members might have noticed. Denzel's posture remained relaxed, but something shifted behind his eyes, like storm clouds gathering on a distant horizon. "The film is what I'm here to discuss, Jimmy." Denzel's voice carried the same measured cadence that had commanded respect in boardrooms and on movie sets for decades. "It's a story I think your audience will really connect with." "Oh, absolutely, absolutely," Kimmel nodded, but his fingers drummed against his desk with barely contained excitement. "But you know, our viewers are always curious about the whole family. Your son John David is making quite a name for himself following in Dad's footsteps, though I understand there have been some challenges recently. The pause that followed lasted perhaps 3 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Denzel's hands, which had been resting casually on the armrests of his chair, tightened almost, imperceptibly. When he spoke, his voice retained its warmth, but there was steel underneath now, the kind of quiet strength that had made him equally convincing as Malcolm X and as a gentle father in countless family dramas. "Jimmy," he said, leaning forward slightly, "I've been doing this for a long time. Long enough to know when someone's fishing in waters they shouldn't be swimming in." His smile never wavered, but the words carried the weight of a man who had spent 40 years protecting what mattered most to him. "Let's keep this about the work, shall we?" The audience stirred, sensing something shift in the atmosphere, though they couldn't quite name what it was. Kimmel's grin widened, but there was something predatory about it now, like a shark that had caught the scent of blood in the water. He leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence of a man who believed his desk made him untouchable. "Oh, come on, Denzel. You can't expect to keep everything locked away when you're America's dad, right?" The host chuckled, but the sound rang hollow in the suddenly tense studio. "I mean, the public is curious. They love your family. They want to know how the Washington household really works." Behind the cameras, a producer shifted nervously, his hand moving instinctively toward his headset. Something in Denzel's stillness was setting off alarm bells, but Kimmel seemed oblivious to the warning signs that seasoned Hollywood professionals had learned to read. Denzel's fingers drummed once against the armrest, a single, controlled movement that spoke volumes to anyone who knew how to listen. When he spoke, his voice carried the same measured tone, but there was a new quality to it now, like the sound of ice cracking under pressure. "The Washington household," he repeated slowly, "is built on love, respect, and boundaries. 3 things that seem to be in short supply in certain corners of entertainment these days." "Boundaries, sure," Kimmel nodded, but his eyes gleamed with the excitement of a man who thought he was witnessing great television. "But come on, 40 years of marriage in Hollywood? That's got to come with some stories, some ups and downs, some drama. I heard there were some rough patches a few years back." "Stop." The word cut through the studio air like a blade. Denzel hadn't raised his voice, hadn't moved from his relaxed position, but something fundamental had shifted. The easy smile was gone now, replaced by an expression that reminded everyone present why this man had so convincingly portrayed soldiers, fighters, and men who demanded respect through presence alone. The audience held its collective breath. Even the camera operators seemed to freeze, sensing that they were witnessing something beyond the usual celebrity interview dynamic. "I'm going to say this once, Jimmy, and I need you to hear me clearly." Denzel's voice dropped to barely above, a whisper, but it carried to every corner of the silent studio. "My wife is not your entertainment. My children are not your content. My family is not your punchline." Kimmel's laugh came out forced and brittle. Hey, I'm just asking questions here. This is what people do on talk shows, Denzel. We talk." "No," Denzel said. And for the first time since sitting down, he leaned forward in his chair. The movement was subtle, but it transformed the entire dynamic of the space. "What you're doing is something else entirely." The silence that followed was deafening. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity, but Kimmel, drunk on what he mistook for compelling television, pushed forward like a man walking blindfolded toward a cliff's edge. "Look, Denzel, I get it. You want to protect the family brand, but come on." Kimmel's voice took on that false intimacy that talk show hosts used when they thought they were breaking through someone's defenses. "Pauletta's been putting up with you for 4 decades. That woman deserves a medal, right? I mean, living with all that intensity, all that method acting stuff you bring home. Must be tough on a marriage when daddy's always in character." Several audience members visibly cringed, some actually covering their mouths as if they could somehow take back what they'd just heard. The camera operators exchanged glances, their professional instincts warring with their human recognition that they were filming something that shouldn't be happening. Denzel went completely still, not the relaxed stillness of a man at ease, but the absolute motionlessness of a predator calculating the precise moment to strike. When he spoke, His voice carried a quality that made grown men on movie sets stop what they were doing and pay attention. "Let me explain something to you, Jimmy." Each word was measured, deliberate, like bullets being loaded into a chamber. "That woman you just disrespected has been my partner, my equal, my strength for 40 years. She's raised 4 children who know the difference between right and wrong, who understand respect, who would never dream of sitting behind a desk and attacking someone's family for applause." Kimmel's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, with renewed, desperate brightness. "Hey, I'm not attacking anyone. I'm just saying what everyone's thinking. You've got this perfect family image, but real families have problems, right? Real marriages have issues. Maybe some counseling here. And there, some separations that got hushed up." The temperature in the studio seemed to plummet. Audience members were now openly uncomfortable, some whispering to each other, others staring at the floor as if they could escape what was happening through sheer force of will. Denzel stood up. It wasn't a dramatic leap or an aggressive lunge. He simply rose from his chair with the fluid grace of a man who had never doubted his own power, who had commanded stages and screens and boardrooms with nothing more than his presence. But in that moment, standing at his full height with 40 years of dignity and respect backing every word, he seemed to fill the entire studio. "Sit down, Jimmy." 2 words, spoken quietly, almost conversationally, but they carried the weight of absolute authority, the kind that comes not from position or title, but from a lifetime of earning respect through character. "This is your last chance to remember that you're talking to a guest, not a target." Kimmel's nervous laugh cracked like breaking glass. "Denzel, come on, this is live television. Let's just sit down and—" "No." The word erupted from Denzel with the force of 40 years of controlled dignity finally finding its voice. "No, we're not going to sit down and pretend this didn't happen. We're not going to laugh it off and cut to commercial and act like you didn't just spend the last 10 minutes trying to destroy my family for your entertainment." The transformation was complete now. The gracious movie star, the diplomatic interview, subject the carefully controlled public figure, all of it stripped away to reveal something far more powerful underneath. This was Denzel Washington, the man, the husband, the father, and he was magnificent in his fury. "You want to know what this really is, Jimmy?" Denzel's voice filled every corner of the studio, resonating with the authority of someone who had spent decades earning the right to speak truth to power. "This is what you people do to black families in this industry. You build us up so you can tear us down. You celebrate our success so you can feast on our failures." Kimmel tried to interrupt, his face now flushed with panic. "That's not... I never said anything about..." "You don't have to say it." Denzel's voice rose to fill the cavernous studio space. "You think I don't see what this is? You think I don't know why you're so fascinated by the idea that my marriage might be troubled, that my children might be struggling, that the Washington family might not be as strong as we appear?" The audience sat in stunned silence, many with their hands pressed to their mouths, witnessing something unprecedented in late-night television history. "It's because you can't stand the idea that a black man in this industry might actually have built something beautiful, something lasting, something that your gossip and your speculation can't touch." Denzel's words came like hammer blows, each one landing with devastating precision. "You need us to be broken, don't you, Jimmy? You need us to be scandalous and dysfunctional because our dignity threatens your comfort." Behind the cameras, crew, members stood frozen, some with tears in their eyes, all of them understanding that they were witnessing a moment of moral reckoning that would be talked about for decades. 40 years, Jimmy. 40 years I've been building a legacy based on respect, on craft, on lifting up everyone around me, and you think you can sit behind that desk and tear it down in 10 minutes for a few laughs? Denzel took a step closer to Kimmel's desk, and the host actually shrank back in his chair. "You picked the wrong family, you picked the wrong man, and you picked the wrong night." The studio had become a cathedral of silence, and Denzel Washington stood as its unwavering priest, delivering judgment with the cold precision of a man who had spent decades observing the machinery of fame, and finally decided to dismantle it piece by piece. "Let me tell you who you really are, Jimmy Kimmel." His voice had dropped to that dangerous whisper that had made him equally convincing as both protector and predator on screen. "You're a man who built his career on the discomfort of others. You invite people to your show not as guests, but as prey. Kimmel's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his usual arsenal of deflecting jokes and nervous laughter completely abandoned. The confidence that had carried him through thousands of interviews had evaporated, leaving behind only a man who suddenly understood he was facing someone far beyond his weight class. "You think I haven't done my homework on you?" Denzel continued, beginning to pace in front of the desk, like a prosecutor addressing a jury. "You think I don't know how you operate? The young actors you've humiliated, the musicians you've mocked, the athletes you've tried to break down for laughs." The audience watched in transfixed horror as their entertainment became education, as the comfortable dynamic of late-night television was inverted before their eyes. "You prey on people who need you more than you need them." Denzel's words cut through the air with surgical precision. "The ones who can't fight back because they're afraid of being blacklisted, afraid of being labeled difficult, afraid of losing opportunities. But I'm not afraid, Jimmy. I've been doing this longer than you've been alive professionally." Kimmel finally found his voice, but it came out as a croak. "Denzel, please, this is getting out of hand." "Out of hand?" Denzel's laugh was sharp and humorless. "No, Jimmy, this is exactly what happens when someone finally calls you to account. This is what happens when you mistake politeness for weakness, when you confuse professional courtesy with vulnerability." The host looked desperately toward his producers, but they stood frozen in the wings, understanding that any intervention would only make things worse. "How you want to know what real strength looks like?" Denzel placed both hands on Kimmel's desk and leaned forward, his presence filling the host's entire field of vision. "Real strength is building something beautiful and protecting it. Real strength is lifting others up instead of tearing them down. Real strength is knowing when to show restraint and when to show teeth." The cameras captured every moment as Kimmel shrank further into his chair, sweat beading on his forehead under the hot studio lights. "And right now, Jimmy, you're seeing my teeth." Denzel straightened to his full height, and in that moment, he seemed to tower over not just Kimmel, but the entire corrupted system that the host represented. The studio lights caught the silver at his temples, transforming him into something mythic, a figure of judgment carved from decades of dignity and respect. "Let me tell you what your legacy will be, Jimmy." His voice carried the weight of absolute moral authority, the kind that comes from a lifetime of choosing the hard right over the easy wrong. "You'll be remembered as the man who thought he could humiliate Denzel Washington on live television and learned the difference between a celebrity and a man of substance." The audience, which had been frozen in uncomfortable silence, began to stir. Some nodded almost imperceptibly. Others leaned forward as if drawn by the magnetic pull of witnessing justice being served. The power in the room had shifted so completely that even the cameras seemed to follow Denzel's movements rather than focusing on the nominal host. "For years you've sat behind that desk and convinced yourself that you were just doing your job, just entertaining people, just asking the questions everyone wants answered." Denzel's words fell like gavels, each sentence a verdict. "But what you've really been doing is participating in the systematic degradation of human dignity for profit." Kimmel tried one last desperate attempt to regain control. "This is my show." "Your show?" Denzel's interruption was swift and devastating. "This isn't your show anymore, Jimmy. This is a moment of reckoning that you invited into your studio when you decided to attack my family. This is what accountability looks like when it finally comes calling." The transformation was complete now. The man who had entered as a guest promoting a film had become something far more powerful. A teacher, a judge, a force of moral clarity in a world that had forgotten what those things looked like. "I want everyone watching this to understand something," Denzel said, turning to address the cameras directly, his voice carrying to millions of homes across America. "There is a difference between entertainment and cruelty. There is a difference between humor and humiliation. And there is a difference between a man who earns respect and a man who demands it." He turned back to Kimmel, who sat slumped in his chair like a defendant awaiting sentencing. "You chose to come for my family, Jimmy. You chose to question my marriage, my parenting, my integrity. You chose to turn my love into your content and my privacy into your punchline." Denzel's smile was cold and final. Now, you get to live with the consequences of those choices. The silence that followed was absolute, pregnant with the weight of a reckoning 40 years in the making. Denzel reached for his microphone pack with the same measured grace he had displayed throughout the evening. But now every movement carried the weight of a man who had just rewritten the rules of engagement in Hollywood. The small device came away from his lapel with a soft click that seemed to echo through the stunned studio like a gunshot. "I came here tonight to talk about a film," he said, placing the microphone carefully on Kimmel's desk, as if it were a gauntlet being thrown down. "Instead, I had to give a masterclass in respect. Consider it my gift to your audience." The cameras continued to roll, capturing every second of television history being made. Audience members sat transfixed, many with their phones raised despite the no recording policy, understanding instinctively that they were witnessing something that would be dissected and discussed for years to come. Kimmel remained slumped in his chair, his face a mask of shock and humiliation. The confident host who had opened the show with his trademark grin was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he'd been hit by a freight train of truth. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. We'll be right back after this commercial break." But Denzel was already walking away, his stride confident and unhurried. He paused at the edge of the stage, turning back one final time to look at the man who had tried to make sport of his family's dignity. "Jimmy," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent studio, "the next time you want to interview someone about their personal life, ask yourself this question. Would I want someone to treat my children the way I'm about to treat this person's children?" With that, Denzel Washington walked off the Jimmy Kimmel live stage for the last time, leaving behind a studio full of people who understood they had just witnessed the end of an era. The audience began to buzz with excited whispers. Crew members exchanged wide-eyed glances, and somewhere in the control room, executives were already calculating the career implications of what had just transpired. Behind his desk, Jimmy Kimmel sat alone in the wreckage of his own making, staring at the microphone that Denzel had left behind, like evidence of a crime. The studio lights continued to blaze overhead, the cameras kept rolling, and the audience waited for something, anything that might restore the familiar rhythm of late-night television. But everyone in that room knew that nothing would ever be quite the same again. The comfortable dynamic between host and guest, the unspoken agreement that celebrities would endure anything for publicity, the assumption that fame came with the price of surrendered dignity, all of it had been shattered by one man's refusal. To play by rules that had never served anyone but the predators. The king had left the building, and in his wake a reckoning had begun.